So this is a short video that I wanted to do about a feature request that I think would enable Cura to do a better job of preventing this general issue of wavelet patterns in large flat areas in a model that prints out. So when you have a single layer that has a very flat surface in a model, the way that that ends up getting printed is it's going to be taking from the top and bottom pattern selection that you have. And you can select a different pattern for the bottom versus the top, and correct for horizontal expansion and a few other things. But basically, the result is a back and forth zigzag pattern that's going to contour around maybe some other features that are in the next layer. So in this case, this is drawing a name in the middle, and it does correctly do something different with the border there. But otherwise, it's pretty focused on doing a back and forth motion. And the problem with this is that as you draw back and forth each line, it's laying down to something that was just laid down and molten and is cooling. And so you have a hot side and a cold side. And for extra crystalline materials, in this case, this was a translucent filament, watermelon red, and using clear filament or something that's marketed as translucent, you'll see these effects a lot more because the cooling process will result in something more crystalline and less amorphous. And crystalline PLA seems to do more curling than something that would freeze amorphously because it has a lot of fillers. So black filament, which has a lot more junk in it, will typically not display this as much unless you really over extrude or do other things that would lead to excess plastic getting laid down in a single layer that would touch more of the other filaments. Now, the thing that I have observed that where this doesn't happen is in the raft layer. So in this case, we have the first layer that's laid down on a glass bed has intentional gaps between each line. And so even though the lines are relatively close to each other, they're not actually touching, and so they end up not significantly thermally interacting enough during their initial cooling after they were laid down. And that makes it so that you don't have an issue with the individual lines curling. They stay flat. Some of that is helped by having a hot bed, but after the first couple of layers, we can see that rafts, even with the insulating layer of this first separate lines layer, the next layer that has things more closely spaced doesn't curl or have any defects typically either. And I think it would make sense to have a pattern where we're not necessarily creating intentional gaps on the first layer, but instead you do something like an interleaving, where you lay down a raft pattern, but then you go back and then also fill in the lines in between so that you have a slight glue between the individual strands that were initially laid down. And the challenge then is whether or not the printer can keep enough alignment to accurately place the second pass over the same layer to get in between these filament lines, or will it be sloppy and maybe let's turn on active pen. Will it be sloppy and end up over here maybe, or even right on top, which are things that you don't want. If we could do that though, then I think you would end up with something that's more like rafts, but you could print at least 2 layers of that with differing angles, and that would give a less flexible, rigid part that has a completely sealed in layer and doesn't have the cooling defects of warping that just has to do with how crystalline or amorphous the freeze of the plastic is. And that's my theory anyway as to what's going on. But I obviously don't know necessarily whether it's specifically crystalline versus amorphous, but just something that seems to happen across the spectrum of stuff with more filler in it versus almost no filler, which are the more clear filaments. They aren't going to be completely glass clear, but they just have so little other than the pure PLA in them that they typically do different things that lead to more defects. And at least from what I've seen, the raft, even with clear translucent filament, prints beautifully every time, and it's really more this normal pattern that Cura has for lines and zigzag of top and bottom layers, where we have real problems laying down a consistent layer that doesn't curl up and towards the extruder and then cause Z collisions that are problematic that fuck up the next layer. So hopefully that gives some insight into what I'd like to see done. I don't know how to program Cura engine, but I think that this would be a worthy addition to the patterns it can generate. Having the extra G code to do the second pass would mean some Z hopping, and I think that that's kind of where this becomes not just tracing a pattern that doesn't collide with itself, but also having a second pattern interleaved that requires picking up and going over the laid down filaments that have already been here. And that extra Z hopping a lot in a given layer could add print time, but I think it would be for just the top and bottom layers, that's not very expensive compared to printing out the actual shell side parts that would make the outline of any given polygon. The polygon outlines are the easiest and fastest part of any print, and it's really filling in this area that, if it goes wrong, causes a lot of problems.